Hi everyone, welcome back to Government 2305. Today's topic is political theory and the Constitution. So to begin with, we will start with a little bit of background on political theory and the theorists who came up with the ideas that eventually lead us to the current U.S. Constitution. So first we'll talk about Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes argued that government is necessary and developed the idea that government power derives from a contract between the governing entities and the people being governed. It was Hobbes' theory that life in a state without government is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He also believed that government should have limits placed on its power. It was Hobbes' idea that there should be an agreement or contract theory where people voluntarily gave up some freedoms in exchange for an ordered society. Remember, Hobbes is the one who came up with the contract theory, a societal contract where we the people are in agreement with government that they will provide services for us. In return, we give up certain freedoms in order to get certain services from them. If we do not have this government, if we don't have a government in place, we end up in a chaotic state. Think of the Purge movies where there is no rules, no laws, everything goes, anything goes for 12 hours. Think of that on a daily basis. So this leads us to John Locke. Locke liked the idea of a social contract, but his concern was about tyranny of the government. And Locke argued that people retain the right to rescind the social contract if government overstepped their authorities. So yes, Locke was in agreement with Hobbes over the social contract theory, right? That there is a contract between the governing bodies and the people being governed. However, Locke was of the idea that we the people have a right to take that power back if government oversteps its bounds. Montesquieu argued one step further. Montesquieu's argument was that power could be controlled, the government's power could be controlled by separating or dividing the power that the government had among various institutions. So this brings us to a government that has separate institutions but overlapping functions. So now we are talking about separation of power, right? We have the three branches. Those are our divisions of government, the three branches: the executive, the judicial, and the legislative branch. So now we have separated government into three branches, into three institutions, but they have overlapping functions. And throughout the semester, we'll talk about those three branches and how they work together and how they have their own functions to fulfill. So now we come to the first founding. So what shapes the first founding, the founding of our country and our first government? Well, to begin with, we have British taxes hurting the colonial economic interests. So what we are talking about is pre-revolution, right? We are talking about the 1760s. The British had financial and debt problems. This leads the British government to impose new taxes on the colonies. Well, new taxes such as the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and other tariffs make commerce that much more difficult for the colonists. This brings about an unlikely partnership, right? We have the merchants and the planters, who generally support British rule, unite with the shopkeepers and the small farmers because they all oppose the taxes. In this instance, they are all united together under one cause: to stop taxation or overtaxation. So they managed to get certain taxes repealed. Once that happens, you would think the merchants and planters would have returned to the status quo. But what we find out and what we see is that the shopkeepers and the farmers push for more reforms. They ultimately want a break from British rule. So we have these 5 sectors, right, with important political interests. We see the New England merchants, the Southern planters, the royalists. We see shopkeepers, artisans, and laborers, and we see small farmers. These are all the groups, the interest groups that are affected by the taxation issues, and these are the people that set about the American Revolution. It is because of these people that we move forward in government and in governing ourselves, right? So what we see is this British tax policies that bring all these people together. And it is because of these policies that culminate in the Tea Act of 1773, right? Everybody has heard of the Boston Tea Party. So once the Boston Tea Party happens, right, the colonists are upset, all this tea gets dumped into the bay. Basically, there's the start of the revolution, right? There's retaliation because of it. And this results in the First Continental Congress. So we have a group of people, of delegates from all over what is the 13 colonies, come and meet to consider independence from Britain. This starts us off on the road to the American Revolution and the American Constitution, both of which are results of a struggle among economic interests and political forces of the United Colonists. That's what the American Revolution was about. It was money, right? We did not want to keep paying money to the British Crown. So we have these 5 different sets of people come together to join for a common cause against British tax policies. It is these people that put us on the road to the American Revolution and ultimately to the current American Constitution. So it is the political strife between these groups, right, that leads to what is considered radicalized colonists. We are not considering radicalized in the means of people that are mob-oriented or rioters. No, these are radicalized to the point. What we are talking about is these 5 groups of people decided to come together and defy the status quo. They decided to defy the state of being of government at that time. So we see 5 interest groups, 5 different groups of people that came together from different walks of life for a common cause to save their economic interests, right? They came together for one sole purpose: to get out from under British rule and British taxation policies. So because of them, we have the Declaration of Independence. Why did we want to break from Britain? Well, as I've been speaking of, it all started because of taxation, right? It was a money issue. So we wanted to get out from under British rule. So what we have is Thomas Jefferson in 1776 writing the Declaration of Independence. It was adopted by the Second Continental Congress. Now remember, Hobbes and Locke and the social contract, they are of the thinking that if we are establishing a government, we the people, then we the people have a right to take back that power that we give government. So consider that as we go through the semester. So the Declaration of Independence, written by Jefferson, has given us unalienable rights. It is asserting that those unalienable rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that these unalienable rights cannot be denied by the government. The Declaration also attempted to identify and articulate principles that would unite the colonists and their various interests so that they might form the basis for national unity. Remember, those 5 different groups had 5 different interests. Their one sole interest was economics, right? But they are all from different backgrounds, different economic statuses, social statuses, and you've got to convince these 5 different groups to come together for the betterment of the nation they are trying to create. So when the Declaration of Independence was written, it was written to address 2 audiences. First, there is an internal audience. The internal audience is the colonists themselves. It is a way of promoting a national unity. What we are trying to do, or what Jefferson is trying to do, is to get the colonists, all of the colonists, to buy in to leaving British rule. So why does he have to convince those 5 different groups of people to leave British rule? Right? You have to stop and consider the circumstances that they find themselves under back in the 1770s, right? There is no government other than British rule. That is what everybody has known. Now, secondly, the Declaration of Independence is addressing an external audience. Back then, there were 3 superpowers. Remember, the United States, as it is today, does not exist at this point. The 3 superpowers were the British, the Spanish, and the French. At this time, we, the colonists, are trying to leave British rule. If we are successful, then that means Spain and France gain power if they help us. We are happy with our geographical location because we are far away from all 3 powers, geographically speaking, right? None of them can get to us quickly. So we are trying to let these 3 powers, or at least the Spanish and the French, we're trying to let them know that we're happy where we are. We won't impede on their properties or on their policies or on their soils. So we are trying to get help and tell them at the same time, hey, you have nothing to worry from us, right? But what's the problem with that? Well, we're lying to them. Look at what our position is in the world today, right? If anything, the U.S. likes to be involved in what is going on, seeing as how we, the United States, has grown to be a superpower, right? But at that point in time, we're just trying to get help. We're trying to get help from Spain and from France in order to get out from under British rule. So this leads us to establishing our first constitution. Now, why is it important to identify and specifically state what the principles of the new nation are, right? We've won the revolution, we're our own country, yay, everybody's celebrating, but now the work begins. Now we have to establish our government. So the first written constitution of the United States is the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were written in 1777, but they were not ratified until 1781. This was the country's first operating constitution until 1789. So written in 1776, ratified in 1781, and it was our constitution until 1789. But there were problems, right? There were problems with the Articles of Confederation. That's the problem, right? It is a confederation. That's the main problem. A confederation is a system in which the states retain sovereign authority except for the powers expressly delegated to the national government. So what we see is, instead of a strong national government, we see strong state governments. And the national government is weak by consideration of today's standards. It is a unicameral Congress, meaning there is only one chamber in Congress, and the execution of laws was left to the individual states. So each individual state had their own laws, their own policies, their own means of enforcement. No one state could impede on the other. There was no central government to give any kind of unifying policy to the states. Even though we had a central government, it was not a strong one. So of course this causes problems. If you have one state that sells or that has laws of one type, it does not mean they are the same laws in the next state. You're going to have problems between the states, and who's going to rectify those problems if you do not have a strong central government. So there is no uniformity between the colonies or the states at this point. Trade. There is no uniform trade or commerce between the various states and between the states and the foreign countries, or the United States and the foreign countries. So at this point, we see foreign countries could attempt to play one state against another to gain better deals. Say France wants to sell wine to Virginia. Well, they'll sell it for one price in Virginia and for a different price in New York. Why? Because there is no uniformity. There is nothing that states that France has to sell their wine for the same price to all states. So this leads to the Annapolis Convention in the fall of 1776, which is right after the original Articles of Confederation was written. This brings together, the Annapolis Convention brings together delegates from several states, and resolved their goal was to not rewrite, but we're trying to revise, right? This is the thinking. They are talking about meeting in order to devise a constitutional revision, right, that would meet the needs of the Union, not a particular state. However, other problems arose which illustrated the weaknesses that the Articles of Confederation brought along with it. Rebellion. I'm sure from your history classes you have heard or read about Shays' Rebellion. So Daniel Shays led a rebellion against the state of Massachusetts to prevent foreclosure of debt-ridden land. But because there was no power at the national level, the national government was unable to respond to the uprising. It was left up to the states to handle their own problems. Well, this leads to what is called the second founding, right? This is how we come about our current day Constitution, because we see that there are issues with our original Constitution, which was the Articles of Confederation. So we have the second founding. It starts off with the Constitutional Convention. Now, the Constitutional Convention occurred in Philadelphia in May of 1787, and it was at this convention that the delegates first set out to revise the Articles of Confederation. But as they get into the revision process, they realize that the flaws they are trying to address are fundamental flaws of a confederation. There is a weak central government. So once the delegates realize this, they decide to attempt to create a new legitimate and effective government. However, once the decision is made, do they go out and announce to the barely formed United States that they have to create a new government, that they have to start all over, even though they just finished a revolution, they just started their governing? Do they go out at this point and tell the world, hey, we've got to rewrite our Constitution? Remember, we just fought a war. We've given power to the states, and now we're about to tell the states we're taking back all that power. Is this going to make the people happy? No, like a big no, capitalized, bolded, underlined. The population is not going to be happy. because not only would this open the door for Britain to retake the colonies, but now we are out there in the world for everybody to see that we are floundering, right? That we have problems. So no, we do not want to let the world know what is going on internally, right? That not only have we met to revise the Constitution, but that our flaws are fundamental in the Articles of Confederation, and that we have realized that instead of revising, we have to attempt to create a new legitimate effective government, that we have to write a whole new document, right? So what we come up with is this marriage of interest and principles. So what we see is that the framers' economic interests were reinforced by their philosophies and ethical principles. So the founders, the framers of the Constitution, sought to create a government to promote commerce and to protect property. We are not talking about individual interests here. They sought a way to promote commerce and protect property. At the same time, they hoped to fashion a government that was less susceptible than the existing state and national regimes to populist forces hostile to the interests of the commercial and propertied classes, right? They wanted a government that was going to work for their interests, the merchants, the upper class, the property owners, not the lower classes. Okay, so this is all about the people with money wanting to make their interests matter, right? To keep their interests going. This is why we say it was a marriage of interest and principle. It was about economic interests, not about people's rights. It was about holding on to your property and to your commerce, to your economy, to your money. So this brings about the issue of representation. So the first issue that we have to address is how the states would be represented in the new government, especially since the states are the ones with power right now. Population was of course the obvious answer, but how many representatives would each state receive? So first we have the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan called for the states to be represented by the population. This gave an advantage to large states and was opposed by the smaller states. Remember, Virginia at this point is considered a large state, so of course they're going to want to use population because they have a lot of people living within their state boundary. Now, the New Jersey Plan. The New Jersey Plan called for equal representation for all states regardless of population. This is because New Jersey is a small state. So we have big state versus small state. So how do we recognize both types of states? Well, we come up with the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise was the final product, and this divided the federal legislature into two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. So now we have a legislature that is bicameral, meaning there are two chambers in Congress, in the legislature, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Representation in the House of Representatives was decided by population. So the more population a state has, the more representation it receives in the House. However, representation in the Senate was set at 2 senators per state regardless of the number of population, right? Regardless of the number of people living in the state, each state is only allowed 2 representatives, 2 senators in the Senate. Now, at this point, there is another issue that comes up with regard to representation. This other issue was very divisive, and we have all come to know it as slavery. That is one of the problems, and it's probably the biggest problem of representation at this point in this early country that is being formed. There were states which allowed slavery, and they wanted slaves to count towards their population for purposes of representation. Of course, slaves were not considered citizens. At the same time, we have non-slave states, which did not want to count slaves in the general population at all. Why? Well, because if you are a non-slave state versus a slave state, then the slave state is going to have more people just by the whole notion of having slaves living within their boundaries, right? So what was finally decided was what is known as the 3/5 Compromise. Oh, let me go back real quick. The 3/5 Compromise stated that a slave would count as 3/5 of a person, and this is how they decided the representation issue with regards to slaves. It settled the issue for the time being. It postponed the issue of slavery and left it to be dealt with later, and that comes up again during the Civil War. So this we will now lead into constitutional powers. I don't want you to think that we are just setting aside these issues that are being brought up as the Constitution is being written, but it is issues that we will touch on as the semester progresses. So I know you have questions, so please hold on to your questions, write them down so that we can discuss them later on in class. Now, the Constitution is being rewritten, right? And as it's being rewritten, we have now created a two-chamber legislative institution, right? We now have a House of Representatives and we have the Senate. So the legislature has been set. Now, the Constitution was created with bold powers and sharp limits on those powers, right? The Great Compromise and the 3/5 Compromise helped temporarily settle the rivalry between the North and the South, and it secured national unity for a time being, of course. So therefore, the framers could focus on a common constitutional framework, right, that would be consistent with common economic and political interests. So we set aside our problems, we postponed them, we put a pin in it, right, to be dealt with at a later time. So now we have the new government that would promote commerce, protect individual property, limit excessive democracy, promote widespread public support of the Constitution, and limit governmental power abuse. These were the common goals that led to the institution of constitutional principles, okay? And it is these constitutional principles and powers that we are going to talk about next. So first and foremost, we just spoke about bicameralism. Congress is divided into two houses or chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The Constitution also leads us to checks and balances. The mechanisms through which each branch of government can participate in and influence the activities of the other branches. So the opportunity for one branch to interfere with another. No, that's not what's happening here. What happens here is that one branch can tell another branch no, right? We're not interfering. What we're showing is that there are going to be means for each branch to check on the other branches, right? And we see this because Congress can override a veto. The president can veto Congress. And the judicial system, meaning the Supreme Court, can deem the laws that Congress tries to pass or that the president tries to pass as unconstitutional. And then we see that the president is the one who appoints appoints judges to the judicial benches, right? But at the same time, it's the Senate who has to confirm those appointments. So there are means for individual institutions to check on the others. Now, as far as checks and balances go, I will put up an infographic on Canvas that will help you better understand how checks and balances work. So please be sure to check on Canvas for this infographic on how the three institutions check each other. Thirdly, we have the Electoral College. This is how we select our president. The president is selected by electors rather than by the direct vote of the population. So the electors from each state meet after the popular election has happened and the votes have been cast, and it is the electors who cast the ballots for the president and vice president. As we have seen in the last two elections, the Electoral College has come into play greatly. It always does, right? Look at how many people voted in the 2020 November general election. We are talking about 150 million people voting, more than that actually. It is up to the Electoral College to then take the votes from their respective states and actually cast the vote for president and vice president. Another power is, of course, the Bill of Rights that is found in the Constitution. Now, the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and these first 10 amendments were written and ratified. They were ratified in 1791. Now, we'll talk on the Bill of Rights a bit more further down. For the time being, just note that this listing is just the constitutional powers. We will talk about them all individually as we go through the semester. Now, separation of powers. Separation of powers is the division of government power among the several institutions which must cooperate in decision making. There are different institutions with separate but overlapping functions. Remember Montesquieu, he was of the separating government into different branches so that no one branch is greater than the others. So Congress writes and passes bills. The president signs bills into law, and the judicial branch deems whether these bills are constitutional or not. So please check Canvas for other graphics that I will put up regarding checks and balances and separation of power. Do not get the two of them confused. If you have questions, email me and let me know. They are not the same thing. Finally, federalism. Now, federalism is the type of governmental system under which the United States operates. It is a division of power that is done by the Constitution. The Constitution has divided power between the central and regional governments. The regional governments in this instance are the state governments. So there is power at the top and there is power down at the bottom with the states, okay? This system of government is called federalism.